Improve your English through stories. The next day at Longbourn, Mr. Collins made not one, but 2 marriage proposals. Right after breakfast, he approached Mrs. Bennet, seeking permission to have a private conversation with Elizabeth. Mrs. Bennet, thrilled by the idea, hurried the other girls out of the room, leaving Elizabeth and Mr. Collins alone. Although Elizabeth initially wanted to leave, she decided to stay, determined to respond politely. Mr. Collins, in a serious tone, complimented Elizabeth's modesty, claiming it added to her charms. He confessed that he had chosen her almost as soon as he entered the house to be his future companion. Trying not to laugh at the idea, Elizabeth listened as Mr. Collins stated his reasons for marriage. Firstly, he believed it was right for a clergyman to set an example by marrying. Secondly, he thought marriage would greatly contribute to his happiness. Lastly, he mentioned his generous patron's advice to marry an active, useful person. Amused, Elizabeth struggled not to laugh, finding it hard to take Mr. Collins seriously. He further explained that he had chosen a Bennet cousin to lessen the family's loss upon her father's eventual demise. Mr. Collins declared his indifference to Elizabeth's limited financial contribution, promising not to make ungenerous references after marriage. Elizabeth, unable to contain herself, interrupted him, expressing gratitude for the compliment but firmly rejecting his proposal. Mr. Collins, undeterred, hoped for a positive response in the future, believing it was common for young ladies to refuse a proposal initially. Elizabeth, with warmth in her tone, insisted that she couldn't accept and wished him happiness. Despite her clear refusal, Mr. Collins remained hopeful, expressing confidence that she would eventually agree to marry him. Mr. Collins, in his self-deceiving manner, continued to argue that his proposal was highly suitable, considering his situation, connections with the de Burgh family, and his relationship to Elizabeth. He emphasized that, despite her admirable qualities, Elizabeth might not receive any other marriage offers due to her limited finances. Elizabeth thanked him but firmly stated that accepting his proposal was impossible, urging him to see her as a thinking creature speaking the truth from her heart. Undeterred, Mr. Collins insisted that Elizabeth would accept eventually, believing her excellent parents would agree. Elizabeth left the room silently, determined to make her refusal clear to her father, Mr. Bennet. Mrs. Bennet, eagerly waiting for the interview's end, congratulated Mr. Collins on what she thought was Elizabeth's acceptance. Mr. Collins, deluding himself, believed Elizabeth's refusal was due to her modesty. Mrs. Bennet, shocked to learn of the refusal, assured Mr. Collins she would make Elizabeth accept. However, Mr. Collins, concerned about obstinacy and foolishness, questioned Elizabeth's suitability as a wife for a man in his situation. Mrs. Bennet rushed to the library, urging Mr. Bennet to intervene. Mr. Bennet, calm and concerned, asked for clarification. Mrs. Bennet explained Elizabeth's refusal and insisted that Mr. Bennet make her marry Mr. Collins. Mr. Bennet, unimpressed, suggested that Mrs. Bennet speak to Elizabeth herself and then declared that there was a hopeless business. Summoned to the library, Elizabeth faced her father's calm scrutiny. Mr. Bennet acknowledged Mr. Collins' offer and Elizabeth's refusal. He presented her with a choice: marry Mr. Collins and be a stranger to her father, or refuse and be a stranger to her mother. Elizabeth, smiling, couldn't help but find the situation amusing. Mrs. Bennet, expecting support, was disappointed when Mr. Bennet stated that he had 2 requests. to accept what he promised and to leave him in peace. Later that day, Charlotte Lucas visited Elizabeth and found the family in great confusion. The younger girls were excited about Mr. Collins' proposal, and Mrs. Bennet was annoyed with Elizabeth. Mrs. Bennet pleaded with Charlotte to persuade Elizabeth to accept, expressing concern about her daughter's future. Elizabeth, warned in the library, remained resolute, and Mr. Bennet, true to his word, chose to keep his peace. Mrs. Bennet, annoyed with Elizabeth's refusal to marry Mr. Collins, expressed her displeasure, mentioning her frequent headaches. She lamented that those who do not complain are never pitied. Elizabeth, determined not to marry Mr. Collins, remained resolute despite her mother's disapproval. As Mr. Collins realized Elizabeth's firm stance, his polite manner turned cold and stiff. He redirected his long speeches and compliments to Charlotte Lucas, who graciously endured them on behalf of the Bennets. The next day, Jane received a surprising letter from Netherfield. The entire party, including Mr. Bingley, was leaving for London, possibly for the winter. Jane was surprised and hurt by the news. Elizabeth, skeptical of Miss Bingley's apparent regret for leaving Jane behind, shared her doubts. Jane read aloud a part of the letter that particularly hurt her. Miss Bingley expressed eagerness to see Mr. Darcy's sister, Georgiana, and hinted at Mr. Darcy's capability of winning any woman's heart. Elizabeth suspected Miss Bingley's insincerity and her desire for Mr. Darcy to marry her friend. Jane, hurt by the letter, believed that Miss Bingley saw her brother's indifference and warned Elizabeth about Mr. Darcy's potential marriage to someone else. Elizabeth disagreed, suggesting that Miss Bingley wanted Jane out of the way to pursue a connection with the Darcys for herself. The sisters debated Miss Bingley's motives, with Jane unable to believe Mr. Bingley's indifference, and Elizabeth remaining skeptical. Charlotte Lucas, visiting the Bennets, suggested that Miss Bingley's real intentions were to encourage Mr. Darcy to marry her friend Miss Darcy, not Jane. Elizabeth couldn't agree with Charlotte, believing that Miss Bingley was incapable of deceiving anyone. Jane, however, was determined to wait for Mr. Bingley's return to Netherfield before making any decisions. Later, the Bennets, along with Mr. Collins, dined with the Lucas family. Charlotte took on the task of listening to Mr. Collins throughout the evening, sparing Elizabeth from his attentions. Unbeknownst to Elizabeth, Charlotte's kindness had a particular aim: to encourage Mr. Collins to transfer his affections to herself. Charlotte's plan seemed to be working, but she underestimated Mr. Collins' character. The next morning, Mr. Collins, driven by his independence, escaped from Longbourn and hurried to Lucas Lodge. Charlotte's plan succeeded, and the couple found themselves engaged quickly, much to the delight of the Lucas family. Lady Lucas began calculating how many more years Mr. Bennet was likely to live, signaling her newfound interest in the Bennet family's future. Charlotte, despite acknowledging that Mr. Collins was neither sensible nor agreeable, was satisfied with her decision to accept his proposal. She had always intended to marry, viewing it as the only honorable way for a well-educated woman with little income to provide a home for herself. At 27, lacking beauty, she considered herself lucky to have found a husband. She understood that Elizabeth, whose friendship she valued, might be astonished and possibly disapproving of her choice. To avoid misunderstandings, Charlotte personally visited Longbourn to share the news. Elizabeth was indeed shocked at first, but after Charlotte explained her reasons, Elizabeth tried hard to understand. When the rest of the Bennet family learned of the engagement, Mrs. Bennet was horrified and complained bitterly about Charlotte's decision, Mr. Collins' stupidity, and Elizabeth's obstinacy. Mr. Bennet, calmer, remarked that Charlotte was as foolish as his wife and more foolish than his daughter. Mr. Collins left Longbourn with many thanks and a promise to return soon. 2 weeks later, he did return to stay at Longbourn but spent most of his time at Lucas Lodge, making wedding arrangements. Mrs. Bennet remained offended, but her attention shifted to a more pressing concern: Mr. Bingley's continued absence. Day after day passed with no news from Mr. Bingley since Caroline Bingley's letter. Elizabeth grew worried, and Jane feared the worst. A second letter from Caroline confirmed their fears. The Bingley family was staying in London for the entire winter, and Georgiana Darcy was frequently in their circle. Miss Bingley joyfully boasted of her brother's probable marriage to Miss Darcy. Jane, deeply upset, tried to control her feelings, assuring Elizabeth that she would forget Mr. Bingley in time. Elizabeth, less optimistic, expressed her skepticism about Mr. Bingley's intentions, believing that his sisters and Mr. Darcy influenced him against Jane. She also used Charlotte's marriage to Mr. Collins as an example of someone making a questionable decision. Jane, always thinking the best of people, defended Charlotte's choice and encouraged Elizabeth not to think badly of Mr. Bingley or his sisters. Elizabeth had to accept Jane's wishes regarding Mr. Bingley's absence, and his name was seldom mentioned between the sisters after that. The following Monday, Mrs. Bennet welcomed her brother, Mr. Gardiner, and his wife, who came to spend Christmas at Longbourn. Mr. Gardiner, despite his occupation as a buyer and seller, proved to be a sensible and gentlemanlike man. Mrs. Gardiner, younger than Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Phillips, was an elegant and intelligent woman, especially favored by the Longbourn nieces. During the visit, Mrs. Gardiner shared the latest fashions but had to endure Mrs. Bennet's complaints. Mrs. Bennet lamented her daughter's lack of success in marriage, blaming Jane's misfortune on Mr. Bingley's interference and expressing frustration at Elizabeth's obstinacy. Mrs. Gardiner, sympathizing with Jane's situation, later spoke privately with Elizabeth, acknowledging the common occurrence of young men forgetting pretty girls after separation. Elizabeth agreed but emphasized that in Jane's case, it was not chance but Mr. Bingley's friends who separated them. Mrs. Gardiner suggested that Jane might benefit from a change of air and offered to bring her back to London. Elizabeth was grateful for the suggestion, hoping it would help Jane recover. Despite Mrs. Gardiner's reassurance that Jane and Mr. Bingley were unlikely to meet in London, Elizabeth secretly thought otherwise, suspecting a possible rekindling of affection. The Gardiner family stayed at Longbourn for a week, during which Mrs. Bennet ensured entertainment for her brother and sister-in-law, including inviting officers to dinner. Mrs. Gardiner noticed Mr. Wickham's frequent visits and Elizabeth's admiration for him. Concerned about Mr. Wickham's lack of fortune, Mrs. Gardiner warned Elizabeth not to get seriously involved with him. Elizabeth assured her aunt that she would take care of herself and Mr. Wickham, expressing admiration for him but pledging to act wisely. The Gardiner family returned to London, taking Jane with them. As Mr. Collins' wedding approached, Mrs. Bennet had to witness Charlotte Lucas become Mrs. Collins. Charlotte requested Elizabeth to visit her in Hunsford, and although Elizabeth anticipated an unenjoyable visit, she agreed to go in March, accompanying Sir William Lucas and his daughter Maria on their intended trip to Hunsford. A week after Jane's departure, Elizabeth received a letter from her sister, mentioning that she had seen Miss Bingley and hoped to continue their friendship. Elizabeth was not surprised to learn a few weeks later that Caroline Bingley had made no further attempts to communicate with Jane. Although Elizabeth felt saddened by Jane's disappointment, she found some cheer in the realization that Jane would no longer be deceived by the sister, and any expectations regarding the brother were now over. Elizabeth, as a punishment for Mr. Bingley, hoped he would soon marry Mr. Darcy's sister, as Wickham had suggested, making him regret what he had lost. Around the same time, Elizabeth received a letter from Mrs. Gardiner inquiring about Wickham. Elizabeth, being honest, replied that there was no danger of her marrying him, as he had transferred his affections to a Miss King who recently inherited £10,000. Elizabeth saw through Wickham's intentions but convinced herself that it was natural for such an agreeable young man to seek fortune and independence. As January and February passed, the time for Elizabeth's visit to Mr. and Mrs. Collins approached. She improved her plan by spending a night in London at her uncle and aunt's house before continuing the journey to Kent. Elizabeth looked forward to seeing Jane, who was still staying with the Gardiners. The journey seemed long due to uninteresting conversations with Sir William and Maria, but Elizabeth was delighted to find Jane looking healthy and lovely upon their arrival at the Gardiners' house. In a private conversation with her aunt, Elizabeth learned that Jane had been suffering from periods of depression despite her attempts to appear cheerful. The following day, Elizabeth and the other travelers set off for Hunsford. Upon arrival, they were excited to see Lady Catherine's great park and, on the other side, the rectory where Mr. and Mrs. Collins warmly welcomed them. Elizabeth was pleased to find that marriage had not changed Mr. Collins' formal politeness and long speeches. She couldn't help but think that he might be speaking particularly to her, trying to make her feel what she had lost in refusing him. Despite Mr. Collins' presence, Elizabeth found the rectory neat and comfortable, and she wondered how Charlotte could appear cheerful with such a companion. However, whenever Mr. Collins said something embarrassing, Charlotte wisely did not appear to be listening. Elizabeth observed that, surprisingly, Charlotte seemed genuinely happy, especially when Mr. Collins could be forgotten. The house felt pleasant and comfortable, and Elizabeth acknowledged that Charlotte seemed to be enjoying her home. He was charming and conversational, and engaged pleasantly with the ladies. On the other hand, Mr. Darcy remained aloof and reserved, speaking only a few formal words to Elizabeth. Elizabeth took the opportunity to inquire about Jane, asking Mr. Darcy if he had seen her in London recently. His response was somewhat evasive, and Elizabeth thought she detected a hint of confusion in his demeanor. Despite this, the conversation was limited, and soon the gentlemen returned to Rosings. The routine in Hunsford continued with frequent visits to Rosings, where Lady Catherine's opinions were expressed assertively, and Mr. Collins continued to heap praises upon his patron. Elizabeth found solace in pleasant conversations with Charlotte, reading books, and walking along a quiet path by Lady Catherine's park. After 2 weeks in Hunsford, Elizabeth learned that Lady Catherine's nephew, Mr. Darcy, and his cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam, were expected to visit Rosings. Upon their arrival, Colonel Fitzwilliam proved to be a gentleman of around 30, pleasant and amiable in conversation. In contrast, Mr. Darcy maintained his cold and proud demeanor, exchanging only a few stiffly polite words with Elizabeth. Despite Mr. Darcy's reserved nature, Elizabeth took the chance to ask if he had seen Jane in London. His response was somewhat unclear, and Elizabeth sensed a subtle hint of confusion in his demeanour. As Easter approached, Lady Catherine extended an invitation to her guests, and when they arrived at Rosings, it became evident that the lady was particularly interested in her nephews, especially Colonel Fitzwilliam. The narrative continues with Elizabeth and Colonel Fitzwilliam engaging in a light-hearted conversation about music. Lady Catherine de Bourgh interrupts them, expressing her opinions on the importance of practice for musical proficiency. She generously invites Elizabeth to practice on the piano in the servants' hall at Rosings, assuring her she won't be in anyone's way. Mr. Darcy appears somewhat embarrassed by his aunt's comments, and Colonel Fitzwilliam persuades Elizabeth to play some music. As Elizabeth starts playing, Mr. Darcy positions himself in front of the piano to observe her. After her performance, she teasingly accuses Mr. Darcy of trying to frighten her, and he responds by suggesting that she occasionally states opinions that are not her own. Colonel Fitzwilliam playfully urges Elizabeth to share some shocking revelations about Mr. Darcy's behavior among strangers. Darcy, appearing confident, welcomes the challenge. Elizabeth then prepares to tell a story about the first time she saw Mr. Darcy at a ball in Hertfordshire, hinting that something dreadful happened. Mr. Darcy unexpectedly arrives at the Collins residence, and Elizabeth is surprised to find him as the sole visitor. This is an unusual and significant occurrence, as Darcy has been portrayed as proud and reserved in his interactions with Elizabeth. The narrative hints at a potential change in their dynamic as Mr. Darcy visits Elizabeth while she is writing to Jane. Mr. Darcy, after arriving and finding Elizabeth alone, engages in a conversation that touches upon various topics. They discuss Mr. Collins' marriage, Mrs. Collins' contentment, and the perceived short distance between her new residence in Hunsford and her family. Mr. Darcy makes an observation about Elizabeth's strong local attachment to Hertfordshire, which surprises her. The atmosphere seems to shift, and the conversation becomes more formal. As they talk about Kent, the exchange is calm and polite, and the interaction takes a colder turn when Mr. Darcy asks about Elizabeth's satisfaction with the region. The conversation is then interrupted by the return of Charlotte and Maria. After the interruption caused by Charlotte and Maria's return, the atmosphere becomes a bit strained. Mr. Darcy continues the conversation with a question about whether Elizabeth enjoys Kent. She responds positively, stating that she finds the county very pleasant. However, the exchange seems somewhat tense, and Mr. Darcy's demeanour remains reserved. The conversation then shifts, and Mr. Darcy brings up the topic of books. He mentions that he is an avid reader and believes that there are not many people who read as much as he does. Elizabeth responds with a touch of irony, expressing her surprise at such a claim. As the conversation progresses, Mr. Darcy becomes more serious and contemplative. He mentions that he often wishes for more leisure time to devote to reading. Elizabeth, in an attempt to lighten the mood, playfully suggests that his wealth and social status should allow him plenty of free time. However, Mr. Darcy's response is not light-hearted. Instead, he expresses that he is constantly occupied with serious matters, suggesting a more somber aspect of his character. The conversation takes an unexpected turn when Mr. Darcy abruptly declares his admiration for Elizabeth and confesses his growing feelings for her. This proposal, however, is far from a romantic declaration. Instead, it takes a critical tone, where Mr. Darcy speaks of his struggle against his feelings and mentions his reservations about Elizabeth's family background and connections. Shocked and offended by his words, Elizabeth rejects Mr. Darcy's proposal emphatically, expressing her disdain for his arrogant and condescending attitude. This pivotal moment in the story marks a significant turning point in the relationship between Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth, intrigued by Colonel Fitzwilliam's mention of Darcy's efforts to prevent a foolish marriage, couldn't help but press for more details. She asked if Darcy's friend was indeed Mr. Bingley and inquired about the specifics of the situation. Colonel Fitzwilliam hesitated for a moment but then confirmed that it was, indeed, Mr. Bingley. He proceeded to narrate the story of how Darcy had intervened to prevent Bingley from marrying a young woman in Hertfordshire. According to Darcy, the young woman lacked the proper social standing and connections that would be expected of someone in Bingley's position. Elizabeth listened to the account with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. She realized that the young woman in question must be her sister, Jane Bennet. It became clear that Darcy, influenced by his own prejudices and pride, had actively discouraged Bingley from pursuing a relationship with Jane. Feeling a mix of emotions, anger, hurt, and a renewed sense of dislike for Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth resolved to confront him about his interference in her sister's happiness. The revelation added another layer of complexity to the already strained relationship between Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy. As Colonel Fitzwilliam continued to talk, Elizabeth couldn't help but wonder about the motivations behind Darcy's actions. Was it solely based on his concerns about social status, or were there deeper personal reasons for his interference? The unfolding events promised a challenging and intriguing resolution to the intricate web of relationships in Pride and Prejudice. Elizabeth couldn't help but be taken aback by Mr. Darcy's unexpected confession. The mixture of astonishment and disbelief was evident on her face as she listened to his impassioned declaration of love. The room, once filled with tension, became charged with an awkward silence. Mr. Darcy continued, pouring out his feelings and confessing the internal struggle he had faced in trying to suppress his emotions. He spoke of his admiration for Elizabeth, his realization of her family's lower social status, and the pride that had hindered him from acknowledging his love sooner. Elizabeth's initial shock transformed into a range of conflicting emotions. She felt a sense of vindication in hearing that Mr. Darcy had indeed been the cause of Jane's separation from Mr. Bingley, confirming her suspicions. However, the sincerity and intensity of his emotions also left her unsettled. Unable to immediately respond, Elizabeth's mind raced. She contemplated the implications of Mr. Darcy's proposal and weighed his words against the principles she held dear. His pride and condescension had long been a source of her disdain, and now, as he bared his soul, she grappled with the complexity of her own feelings. Finally, Elizabeth found her voice and spoke with a mixture of astonishment and reproach. She addressed Mr. Darcy's interference in Jane's happiness and the insult to her family. She challenged his assumptions about social status and expressed her unequivocal rejection of his proposal. In a passionate and eloquent response, Elizabeth asserted her independence and pride, rejecting the idea of marrying someone who had so gravely injured her sister and insulted her family. Mr. Darcy, though visibly affected, attempted to argue his case, but Elizabeth was resolute. As Mr. Darcy left the room, Elizabeth's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She had just refused a proposal from a man she had long despised, and yet, The encounter had revealed a vulnerability and complexity in Mr. Darcy that she had not expected. The events that unfolded in the wake of this unexpected proposal would undoubtedly shape the course of their relationship and the trajectory of the novel. Elizabeth was taken aback by Mr. Darcy's unapologetic admission regarding Jane and Mr. Bingley. She felt a mix of anger and disbelief at his lack of remorse for his actions. His mention of Mr. Wickham further fueled her resentment. Darcy's attempt to shift the focus to Mr. Wickham only intensified Elizabeth's frustration. She saw through his diversionary tactics and remained steadfast in her condemnation of his interference in Jane's happiness. The mention of Mr. Wickham only added to the complexity of the situation. Mr. Darcy's defense of Mr. Wickham's unfortunate life did little to sway Elizabeth's opinion. Instead, it deepened her skepticism, suspecting that Darcy might be manipulating the narrative to his advantage. Their confrontation reached a heightened intensity, with both parties expressing their grievances. Darcy, visibly angered and struggling to maintain composure, attempted to justify his actions, while Elizabeth stood firm in her accusations. The air was thick with tension as the two exchanged heated words, laying bare the long-standing animosity and misunderstandings between them. The outcome of this confrontation would undoubtedly shape the course of their relationship, and the repercussions would be felt far beyond the confines of that room. The letter, which was from Mr. Darcy, contained a detailed explanation of his actions and a defense of his character. He admitted to his role in separating Jane and Mr. Bingley, explaining that he believed Jane's feelings for Bingley were not sincere. Darcy also provided a different perspective on his relationship with Mr. Wickham. According to Darcy, Mr. Wickham had been employed by Darcy's father as a steward on the family estate. When Darcy's father passed away, he left Mr. Wickham a substantial legacy, expecting him to pursue a career in law. However, Wickham chose to receive the money immediately and abandoned his legal studies. Darcy insisted that Wickham's subsequent complaints and accusations against him were unfounded and that Wickham had behaved inappropriately. Reading the letter, Elizabeth found herself torn between her natural inclination to believe Mr. Wickham and the possibility that Darcy's account might have some truth to it. Confused and troubled, she continued her walk, contemplating the contents of the letter. As she walked, she met Colonel Fitzwilliam, who inquired about her well-being and the letter Darcy had given her. Elizabeth, feeling a need to discuss the matter, shared the contents of the letter with Colonel Fitzwilliam. He confirmed Darcy's account of Mr. Wickham's misbehavior, revealing that Wickham had squandered the money intended for his legal studies and debts. The revelation left Elizabeth in a state of shock and reconsideration. She grappled with the conflicting accounts of Mr. Wickham's character and wondered about the truth of the matter. The unfolding events raised questions about trust, deception, and the complexity of human relationships. The letter from Darcy and the subsequent conversation with Colonel Fitzwilliam marked a turning point in Elizabeth's understanding of the people around her, adding layers of complexity to the relationships in her life. Darcy expressed regret for any discomfort caused by the previous night's proposal and assured Elizabeth that he wouldn't repeat it, recognizing that such wishes were best left forgotten for both their happiness. He felt compelled to defend his character against accusations made the night before. Firstly, Darcy explained his interference in Bingley and Jane's potential union. He observed Jane closely but misinterpreted her calm demeanor as indifference. His objections were fueled not only by social considerations but also by the behavior of Elizabeth's family during the Netherfield ball. Darcy then delved into his strained history with Wickham. He disclosed that Wickham, whose father worked for the Darcy family, was initially supported for education. However, Wickham's moral shortcomings surfaced, leading to a financial settlement instead of a church post. Additionally, Darcy revealed a distressing incident involving his sister Georgiana and Wickham during a holiday in Ramsgate. Wickham's ulterior motives became apparent, but Darcy intervened, dismissing the companion and preventing a disastrous elopement. Darcy urged Elizabeth to verify his statements with his cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam, who could vouch for the truth of his narrative.